Welcome to 600 Seconds with Red Thread. My name is Dani Johnson, and I'm here with Charles Newnam, who is the Vice President and General Manager of Learning and Leadership at Perceptyx. Did I get that title right, Charles?
Yeah, you're great. Yeah.
Wonderful. It's good to have you here. I wanted to talk to you specifically because you are in charge of this sort of foray that Perceptyx is making into learning and leadership. About, I think it was 3 months ago now, you acquired Lyceum.
Yeah. We did, yeah. We acquired them, and then we launched with the integrated platform about 2 weeks ago, almost not quite 2 weeks ago.
Good grief. So you've been pretty busy, probably.
Pretty busy, yeah.
Perceptyx has traditionally been an employee listening organization. Mm-hmm. Why are you getting into this space?
Perceptyx has been in employee listening. So we got 23 years of experience in that. We got tons of data. And I think we're pretty well known, like in the world, as like being in that space. You know, a long time ago, so I've known Joe, the Chief Product Officer, for many years. We've often collaborated, brainstormed, talked, and they acquired another company years ago, which kind of got them into that nudge space, with like that activate the engine, activating, leaders, things like that. And so what we've kind of been thinking in talking with Joe about this for years is like, wouldn't it be great if we had a system that could automatically just change behavior at scale and then help close like those capability gaps? And so we've sort of been dreaming about that for a while. And I really think the technology and like the leadership at Perceptyx all kind of came together at a time where this is possible. Like, we can do this. And so I think it was just like seeing the world changing, seeing technology change, and seeing what's possible. And, Joe called me up last fall and said, "Hey, do you want to come over and actually build this thing with me?" And I was like, "Yeah, like, let's do it." So that's kind of how it happened.
That's really cool. So maybe take us through the vision of what this does. So it listens to the employees, and then what happens?
Yeah. So it listens to the employees. And so that can go on many different levels. So we're talking like, it could be individual with like a 360. It could be your team through like a pulse survey, or like, an engagement survey, your function, your business unit, and then your organizational goals, and at that level. And so what it automatically do, it can identify like these areas for improvement that we need to make. And, you have a human involved that can do it, but the AI can also do it, make recommendations too. So all of a sudden I'm getting like these nudges on like behavior changes or things that I can consider and think to lean into some of the gaps that have already been identified. And so that's one thing right off the bat. Well, the cool thing about like what we've got with the developed stuff now after that acquisition is like, what if I don't know how to do that? What if I need some upskilling on how to like change the behavior, or have, lean into like more resiliency, or like, change leadership or something like that? It can automatically take me then there and put me into like a develop course. So I go through the course, and then the activate engine, the nudges then become reinforcement. So it's reinforcement of that learning to make sure that the learning sticks. And ultimately what we're doing is if it's a bit like a behavioral skill set that we're training on, we go back and see, is it making a difference in the employee listening? Like, are employees having a different experience with their managers now because this whole loop is conducted? And if not, it goes back and tries again. So it's constantly trying to learn how you or your team or organization learns and making those changes.
That's interesting. And I'm assuming, since you have all of the data for the employee listening, and then you're collecting data, I'm assuming from these interactions, as well as feeding that back into the system. Since it all exists in one place, you have a lot more capability of actually creating those loops and making those things happen than you have in the past. And one of those.
And we call that like contextually aware AI. So like my AI coach shows up to me. It already knows me, it knows my team, it knows my organization, and it's giving me very specific guidance about whatever the thing is that I'm trying to work through. Whereas if you just go in and, you can ask Claude or Gemini or, ChatGPT, it'll give you some, basic guidance, but it's not, hey, these are the 3 drivers of like your team's engagement, and this is how, and you're worried about burnout. Well, focus on these 2 things because these are what's showing up in the data. So it's a very different experience than if it just gives you some like general guidance on like, how to show up for your team.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting because you talked about something that I'm hearing a lot about right now, which is context. So within the context of a team, or within the context of me individually, like what am I trying to accomplish as a person? Are you also looking at it more broadly on maybe an organizational scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So like it's a multi-level contextually aware. So it may be giving like, so my AI coach, or like a course that I may be taking, or let's say I'm in like the sales department, I'm trying to upskill on like, how to be a better salesperson, something like that. It's factoring in all of that contextual awareness. So maybe I'm getting a nudge, or maybe I'm getting some training because of the organizational strategy. Maybe if I'm interacting with my AI coach and I'm having a question about how to have a conversation with my team, it's giving me specific to like the team context. So I may be getting stuff coming to me, but it always always lets me know. Like, so ours is designed because people want to know, like, why are you telling me this? Why did you recommend this to me? So it says, oh, recommended this because it's like organizational strategy, or recommended this because it came back on your engagement score of XYZ. So that's, or you define that as like a user input. That's something you want to work on. So it's always telling me as to why it may be pushing something to me. So I have that understanding, but it's a multi-level contextual aware system.
This is obviously you're moving into a different space than you have before. Can you talk a little bit about who the buyer is for this? Is it a sort of an add-on to the buyer that you already have, or are you going after a completely different buyer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something we're actively experimenting with and trying to learn right now. I have a belief that obviously L&D, like if you're a chief learning officer, you're head of L&D, or like head of leadership development, or CHRO, those are absolutely like would fit into kind of someone we want to talk to. I also think there's strong use case, and we are establishing more relationships with like functional leads. So I mentioned like salespeople, or like maybe it's in IT, maybe it's in operations, because develop works really well at like upskilling or reskilling on technical skills as well. So I'd love to go in and try some things. It's like, hey, you're in sales. Like, do you want to give different sales training, or you need to upskill your salespeople on a certain product that you're just launching? Leveraging our develop suite to help kick that engine into. So I think we'll probably start seeing buyers outside of the business, or maybe even more in collaboration with the business and launching some of these use cases.
Interesting. So I see you all, for a long time, you've been fully in sort of that listening space, and now you're branching out. I think the interesting thing is that we're seeing a lot of technologies do the same thing. So some of the HCMs are providing some of these types of things as well. And they're kind of dipping into your backyard, which is employee listening. We're seeing the same thing in learning technology. We just finished a big study on learning technology. And what we found was that, so many organizations are dipping into the before. Let's go ahead and diagnose the gaps that are there, and also the after. How do we help them correct that? And how do we feed that information back into the loop? And so we're hearing a lot of these closed loop discussions that are going on right now. I'm curious, how will you differentiate yourself in kind of what's becoming a noisy message?
Yeah. No, it definitely is. And I'm realizing this more week over week. With people that are using the same words, but like I think different meaning behind them. I think one thing is like I said, our 23 years in employee, experience and employee data. It's like we've got decades, and terabytes of just information that we can, look at correlations and what works, what doesn't work, our 3,000 proprietary nudges that are proven to change behaviors, things like that. So, we aren't building these agents just with like a developer that's like, hey, go figure out what best practice is and like do this. Like these are, we got hundreds of years of PhDs combined that are putting their thought capital into to develop these agents. So, whether that's from the behavior space or from like the instructional design, whatever, it's very literature based and evidence based that we built these agents on. So I think that's one differentiator that we have there too. I think the other thing that's really cool with us is that we measure for comprehension. We validate the understanding of the person in the course, and it's adaptive. So meaning that if I'm an expert, it may take me 5 minutes to finish a course. And it evaluates my comprehension level at satisfactory, and I move on. If I'm totally new to it, that may be an hour long, conversation, but we're measuring for comprehension, and it's done in a way that you can't like fake it out. It's not like just using AI to give you a quiz or something like that. We're literally looking like what's actually getting into your head, and are you able to discuss in a meaningful way? So I think that's a very big differentiation, especially when I've had the chance to play around with some other products in this space. I think ours is, I think time will tell. I think it's better. Obviously I'm biased, but it's certainly different. It's unquestionably different.
Okay. One more question for you. And I think I've had this conversation with Joe and maybe some others at Perceptyx as well, but how are you sitting in the larger ecosystem? So clearly data is becoming important to make sure that AI works across the organization. And I'm just curious, does your data get fed into other systems? How are you playing nicely with all those other systems?
I brag about Joe a lot. Like Joe's brilliant. We've got like a huge API and MCP strategy. We can, put our AI coach right in through Copilot. So the end user, if Copilot's what shows up for you, you think you're interacting with Copilot, but actually it's Perceptyx, on the back end of that's talking to you. We could tie into all kinds of like LMS. So if you want to keep that as like a place to keep your records of like who's completed what courses. Like it can kick it out from there. You do the experience with us, and then it kicks it back in and it feeds that back to the completion and things like that. So we're designed. I mean, of course, we'd love to come in and be your entire, platform to do it end to end. But if you're using a different employee experience company, that's okay. We can tap into that data and then get that contextual awareness from there. So we're really trying to come in. And if we want to play in a little bit of piece of the puzzle, we can. Like we've built ourselves that way. Obviously, we think there's a tech stack consolidation that you could do with us too. But we see our sales like complementing like an LMS. But if you've got like, a learning agent company with a coach, and then you've got some random hodgepodge of different survey things you're doing and all that kind of stuff, we'd love to come in and just, take over all of that. I think there's some price implications for that too, I
think one of the most interesting points that you've made is this idea that you're going to the end user. So you're not necessarily going in through L&D and HR anymore. I can see your solution being really useful to organizations and functions that are trying to solve specific problems and spinning up that way. So that's super interesting. Charles, thanks for being with me today.
Yeah, no, it's been fun. Thanks.
Hey, I just finished talking to Charles Newnam, who's the Vice President and General Manager of Learning and Leadership at Perceptyx. I want to talk maybe about a few things that stood out to me from that conversation. The first one is that obviously Perceptyx is new to this space. They have a lot of data about employees because they're in the employee listening space, and they want to apply that to actual helping employees develop. What I think is particularly interesting about that is that all the other vendors are trying to do the same thing. So we're seeing HCM and traditionally HR types of technologies do this. And we're also seeing the learning space dive in pretty deeply here as well. The second thing that I think stood out to me was this idea of courses. He mentioned courses, serving up courses, which is a fairly traditional way to think about employee development, especially given the conversations and how they've changed in the last year or so. But I know that their new platform, and mostly what they bought from Lyceum, is a coach that can work within the context to both teach and to assess. And so they're not thinking entirely traditionally about it, but the fact that courses are still a large part of the solution is something that I found interesting. Third thing that I've found particularly telling is that Perceptyx is also an unknown quantity when it comes to the learning space. And that could either be a blessing or a curse. What I do know about that particular buyer in the learning space is that the leaders are looking for technology that can actually provide the solution, not necessarily just provide the technology that they can use to build the solution. And the way that Perceptyx is talking about this sort of closed loop system will help you diagnose the problem and teach the people and then measure whether or not they can do the thing is really a strong, marketing message right now. One that we're hearing a little bit more, but it's stronger than the traditional way that most learning technologies have talked about. I do think that the fact that they're unknown and therefore may speak about employee development a little bit differently may give them broader appeal in the lines of business. He mentioned that they were seeing use cases where they're going into the businesses rather than going in through L&D. It may be actually a blessing because they're not using L&D speak there. So we'll just see on that one. The final thing that I pulled out of this conversation was the bit about where they fit in the overall learning tech stack. We're seeing a lot of learning technologies move to more of a committee buy, which means it's not just the CLO that needs to buy off on this technology, but also the CHRO and sometimes the head of talent. And in many cases, even the CIO. They at least need to buy off on it. Since Perceptyx already sits in the CHRO orbit, that actually may, and I really do mean may here, may give them a leg up over some of the learning technologies that are trying to do the same types of things because those learning technologies have the traditional buyer of CLO and haven't made the steps out yet. So it's a really interesting conversation to me. I'm looking forward to talking to Charles again once they are a little bit further down the road.